Joining us now is Steven W Thrasher. He's a writer at large for The Guardian U.S. Steven, how you doing?
I'm well. Thanks for having me on.
It's great to have you on. I really appreciate you taking the time. So you have a new a piece out that came out recently. I think it was over the weekend or on Friday. And it's called Black Lives Matter Showed Us the Oppression of Black People is Borderless. Explain what you mean by that. Set the context for this conversation.
Sure. Writing for The Guardian U.S., I have this unique opportunity to sort of write for a British and worldwide audience as well as an American audience. As we've seen in The Guardian with the Edward Snowden stories, we write things that are very particular to the United States, but can have worldwide implications. Right. And I actually set out, I tried to walk the line between both, but I actually wrote this piece very specifically for our British and international readers because I wanted to think about the ways that this was not just an American phenomenon that's happened over the past year, but how it related to things happening politically worldwide with Black people.
Yeah, and I think that partially what I really appreciated about your piece, I appreciate a lot about your piece, but you were setting it, in order to get the global setting, you need to have a historical setting. So you talked about how really, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in some senses, when you start, first of all, by introducing the notion, obviously, that race is a constructed thing, and there is a specific colonial and imperial history to that construction. And then when you talk about, as an example, relating it to Palestinian human rights or Ethiopian Jews in Israel, which I'd like you to elaborate on, and I think that this has actually come up in, and I apologize that I'm kind of jumping a little bit here, but I think it all can be packed together. The problematic and delusional response to Black Lives Matter with All Lives Matter. And we've discussed a lot why that's a problem, and you can elaborate on that too, obviously. But I think what you're doing, which is interesting, which is that in a certain sense, Black Lives Matter is very specific to a present, historical condition in America and a present crisis. And a long-term crisis with policing and the sort of state apparatus and Black people. But then when you start talking about Palestinians and you start talking about, people just sort of on the receiving end of power structure, essentially, it seems to me that Black lives start to represent something that is, it's global Black lives, but it's also just sort of global lives on the receiving end of oppression. Does that make sense? Is that a correct read?
Yeah, it definitely does. I mean, I came to this column and this way of thinking through a couple of different paths. First would probably be thinking back on my childhood when my father was involved with the anti-apartheid campaigns in the 1980s and early 1990, 91 until Mandela got out. And back then, we didn't have the internet. People were very isolated in how they were able to connect about these things and organize around these things. And so there was kind of my father died about 10 years ago, and I'm sad he never sort of had the validation and joy I think he would have had if he had been living in this time of being able to connect with other people and see other people in similar struggles. And I think that's a lot of how race has been connected. In addition to my work for The Guardian, I'm also a doctoral student in American Studies, and a lot of what I have been looking at is how race was a social construct that was made in particular ways through slavery here in the United States, but also very much through colonialism, particularly British colonialism, and how our notions of what it means to be Black or be white and the advantages or disadvantages that have manifested themselves through law and society are relatively new. They're only a few hundred years old in our long human history on this planet. So I've been interested in trying to kind of figure out how has that process separated us from one another. And I very much feel like in my childhood, my father and the people he was involved with would sort of be laughed at for wanting to have something to do with South Africa, and what do you care about something that's happening 9,000 miles away? And I can sort of understand how we were very much encouraged to think of ourselves as separate and at kind of best to say, well, you're lucky to be in the United States. You could have been in poor Africa and stop complaining. And so I think what's really beautiful and fascinating right now is you see this circulation happening very quickly. We have an ability to connect with each other around the globe, to see what problems are happening in other places, to understand how, as I wrote in my column about that hard to watch but really beautiful Slate interactive map that shows how slavery moved around the world, we can kind of see how these patterns are playing out in different places. One of the most controversial, but I think fascinating, was to see how Black Lives Matter was connecting in Palestine. There was a historic trip that happened between young people that went both directions. Palestinians came to the United States, and Black Americans went to Palestine, and they got to see what that was like. I was in the occupied territories about 5 or 6 years ago, and that was the first time I had really had a sense of how kind of at their best, when Israelis will hold up sort of a model idea of what works well, they'll often talk about the city of Haifa as being a good coexistence. And at best, I think it kind of looks like our segregated South of the 60s. And that's kind of the best situation. What's happening in the occupied territories is much more oppressive. So I think it's so fascinating to see very young people making these links. And then, as I also wrote in my piece, it was fascinating also to see Ethiopian Israelis also invoke Black Lives Matter, to see that as they were realizing they were being, not realizing, but as fighting back against police abuse that they experience as Black Israelis in a complicated society that's not, it's not exactly analogous to the United States, but they could understand how this was quite like what was happening in Baltimore. So to see Black Lives Matter sort of being invoked by Palestinians and also by Black Israelis made me realize this idea can kind of travel anywhere. And it's so kind of fascinating and in a way joyous to see these ideas jumping from academia to hip hop, across different countries and just moving very fast in a very different way than when I think back on how my dad was involved in these letter writing campaigns and things like that happened with apartheid. It was not happening so quickly.
Right. And the ANC, I'm sure, would have had a very sophisticated social media campaign. And actually, in some ways, the ANC, with their sort of use of cultural diplomacy and things like that, were sort of forerunners of some of this type of activism. It's really interesting. But I want to touch again and on Israel for a moment. I mean, we talk about certainly that issue sometimes on this show. Almost everybody on this show has some Jewish background. And it is an interesting thing taken from, like, if you read as an example, even Malcolm X, and I don't think he had a particular focus on this issue, but in his sort of Nation of Islam phase, he would throw Israel out as an example of like, well, that's a good thing because that's a state for the Jewish people, and you need a state for the Black people, and you need a state for Korean people, whatever the sort of sense of separation. And then, it seemed like his kind of views of that shifted in his more sort of global kind of anti-colonial solidarity phase. And I think, the perception of what Israel is inside movements in the United States, when at certain times it's been seen as this kind of place of refuge for people who've been victims of genocide, sort of setting up their own in some respects, socialist system, frankly. And then recently, and over the past several decades, obviously, it's really formed into something quite different in the progressive imagination. And it seemed like for a little while, a lot of people wanted to kind of avoid that conversation because of how controversial it is. But it's popping up very strongly in Black Lives Matter. And I guess, and I think is just to underscore what you're saying, is that your sort of prime example in many ways of just how global this is at this point?
Yeah, it is. I wouldn't necessarily say it's better or worse. I think that, and I could talk, a little bit more about Israel, my evolution of thinking about it. But kind of the two big international things that popped out at me were seeing this existing in both Israel and Palestine, but also a plethora of great writing about Sisera the lion. And how people have reacted to the death of this lion. And it's been interesting to watch writers and myself sort of examine why is it that we as a society react in a certain way to the death of a lion differently than the death of Black Americans. But then also, for me, also to think about, okay, we shouldn't just think about Black Americans, but what does this mean for people in Zimbabwe, and how are we privileging our own, like kind of our own conversation about it, versus the lived reality of people in Zimbabwe, and what does this say about colonialism? And it's not simple. I think that there are great critiques of colonialism in the way the lion was hunted. There are also great critiques of it in forgetting about what a lion means in the country where it was, and that they might not think about it the same way that we do. And that, of course,
Elaborate on that. What's the Cecil story in all of this?
Well, initially there was the initial critique was that this lion was being prized more than the lives of Black Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that there was a very fair critique in saying that there's something gross and colonialist about Americans or people from Europe going to any of these countries and sort of paying tens of thousands of dollars and taking something that is considered a national prize and just thinking we can pay for it and go take it. But then it was really interesting for me to read, particularly there was a piece written by a graduate student and published in the New York Times, I think, last week, about what the role of the lion is there and how people don't necessarily love lions. But also that he was just so surprised at how much outpouring people were saying that they felt sorry for him. And he said people who seem concerned about the death of the lion, but not about the way the lions kill people, and more importantly, and sort of more at a larger scale, that they had never expressed much in the ways that his countrymen and countrywomen had suffered by colonialism and by economics and hunger that was caused death that was caused not just by a lion. So that I thought was really, quite interesting to read at several levels. In terms of Israel and Palestine, my own experience, which was not long, I was just in that region of the world for a few weeks, several years ago, but it was really amazing for me. I had spent, prior to that, I had been touring around the United States with the NPR StoryCorps project, and I was collecting stories about the civil rights experience of the 1960s and 50s for their Griot project, African American project. And in the South, I was just experiencing firsthand stories from people about segregation and what it was like to be just very overtly controlled by race in a way that I usually haven't been. My parents and grandparents were, but my experience with racism had not been so overt. And shortly after I had that experience, I was in Israel and Palestine, and the first few weeks I was there, I was with an Israeli friend, and I was mostly in private settings. But the second half of my trip, I traveled by myself, and I was mostly alone and using public settings. And people typically thought that I was Arab or Palestinian for my parents. Mm-hmm. So I got to experience kind of what that felt like as a single man of sort of prime age where one is considered suspicious traveling alone. Ultimately, my American passport got me out of every problematic situation I was in, so I had that level of privilege. But it was really amazing for me to see how completely people are policed in a way we would find entirely inappropriate here in the United States.
Sure.
And yet it, is as violent and overt as our forms of segregation looked, in this country decades ago, but it's just everyday life there. And then, I don't like to say that we are divorced from that at all in the United States. Fast forward to Ferguson, including last night, and we see that the same forms of really violent racial segregation and freedom of movement are being imposed again. So I think that it's really great that the young people are talking to each other about what it feels like to be occupied. And certainly as a journalist, I feel like I've been operating in occupied space the past year when I've been reporting in places like Baltimore or Ferguson, and the police are directly telling us that we have to leave and can't do our work. It certainly does feel like a military occupation.
So what do you see emerging from this? You're talking about, and it's interesting because in some ways it's a story that tracks with, many things, which is sort of, in some respects, the positive aspects of technology, collapsing borders, allowing people to have more kind of peer-to-peer conversations. What is the what do you sort of see coming out of this? What kind of new tactics, creativity, organizing, or even just ways of people understanding themselves and their context? Like what's the upshot of a kind of globalized Black Lives Matter over the coming decade?
The upshot is that most people in this world are not white, so that there's no
Really?
reason why they
No, I'm just kidding.
so that they should. There's no reason why they should not have political power in the connection of their voices, and that things that operate from white supremacy should not be allowed. People are often kept segmented from each other, but I think if they're able to be in conversation with each other, that should give strength to their arguments and strength to the movement. And I think it's really interesting. As I've been sort of studying in grad school about economics and looking at things from a Marxist critique, I think that Occupy Wall Street really sort of wanted to have this either some format of Marxist or Marxist light attempt to connect people who felt oppressed and to band together their collective ability.
Yes, it did.
And
I
it just
think, yeah.
didn't, it didn't quite work. I mean, not that it is a part of what's happening now, but it had a hard time. It had a very difficult time with race, and it had a really hard time sort of getting to an escape velocity momentum of connecting different people in different places. It didn't quite get through its first year. And Black Lives Matter has gone through a year, which is a pretty big thing to have done. And it is connecting these people in all these different places. And I think it sort of stands in its next frontier, as we're seeing a little bit play out right now. It stands to try to actually connect white people against some of the shared oppression. There's a Zachary Hammond case, a young man who was killed by police. And I think it's getting to a
Right.
point where it's starting to raise some consciousness about how white people are oppressed by police. And there are almost a million black people in prison, but there are about a million white people in prison in
And
the
there's
United States too.
and that class is really the intersecting, thing that I think. I
Yeah.
mean, that's certainly from my perspective. I'm informed, I guess, by that kind of Marxist reading too, and I think that class is really, it's almost it's off. I mean, obviously in America, it's a very underrepresented aspect of the conversation, and then when you connect it with race, that's a whole zone that nobody wants to get near. But I think, the one thing that, and I know that just because a lot of people that listen to and watch this program care and think a lot about, and I haven't wanted to sort of overly pay attention, frankly, to Black Lives Matter and Bernie Sanders, because I think, I've talked about it. I talked about it on HuffPost Live a couple weeks ago. We covered the initial thing at Netroots Nation, which I actually thought was, I mean, clear, demonstrably, it was effective activism, because look at what's happened as a result. But I know that some people are very kind of upset by what happened in Seattle. I'll be blunt. I don't really think I don't think it was effective. And I think but I think at the same time, that is a sort of place that starts to bring up very familiar and very difficult questions about how do you have community without unity, or unity without community, or how do you make bridges without obscuring? We talked about President Obama's campaign in some ways as this kind of brilliant branding of kind of obscuring, in some respects, really core differences in race and class. And now, at least electorally, Bernie Sanders is obviously representing at least something on a class level. How that movement relates to his campaign and how that campaign relates to its Black Lives Matter, that's a difficult territory, and it's going to bring out a lot of problems. And I just kind of want to get your impression of it before we end the conversation.
Sure. I mean, the biggest hole. I think Sanders has had two holes ideologically, from my particular leftist perspective. One has been gun control, which
Sure.
I think he's going to have to wrestle with and is wrestling with, just because of what happens every week in this country.
Right.
The other big blind spot I thought he's had is race. He has a way. I mean, I think his economic platform is a much potentially better one for people of color than Obama's all boats will be lifted by the rising tide if we subsidize Wall Street approach.
Right, right,
But
right.
he has had this big hole, which I think the Black Lives Matter people have actually done a very good job of getting him to confront and argue with, and it's going to be uncomfortable. I think that Seattle had a result. He hired this young black woman a few hours later. She's actually, initiated as a spokeswoman. She's initiated some really great conversation. At the same day that we found out that a lot of the leaders of the movement have been meeting with the Democratic nominees. So,
That's right.
I personally don't have a problem with people grabbing the mic. I don't think anything really bad comes from it. It makes people talk about it more. It's not hurting Sanders. He just keeps going up. But I do think, we are in this place of crisis, which I think is much easier for white people, and maybe especially for white progressive allies, people who are very staunch Bernie Sanders. It's much easier for them to not understand how this affects us. So last night, I'm not in Ferguson now. I've been there 4 times this year, but I couldn't really sleep last night once I started seeing what was happening on Twitter. And it's a level of anxiety I live with a lot, and lots of black people I know live with. And having to address that constantly, even when it's uncomfortable in some creative way, it causes for the need for disruption. So I think that the people in Seattle they were not ill-intentioned, and they actually got a little bit of results. And there'll be things that happen that aren't perfect, but the conflict and the conversation are necessary to keep happening as long as this crisis continues.
Right. And I would hope, I would like to see, I think the paradox is that, Hillary Clinton's campaign is much less accessible and open. So it sort of leaves the paradox of, Bernie's more accessible so that this can happen to him more just functionally. But I think, I would really like to see, I guess I would not only like to see it with Hillary Clinton, but I actually think with Bernie, it's more of, it's not positive either, more omission and delusion in some ways. I think with the Clintons, there's actually a very specific and very, very wrong-headed history on some of these issues, which really do need to be ironed out, at least during the primary, whether it's 3 strikes laws, whether it's signing, Ray Rector's death warrant, or frankly, even something like welfare reform, which has been a part of, Bill Clinton's legacy in the mainstream, but something that had a really disastrous effect on poor people across the board, and obviously particularly African Americans and Hispanic people, in my view. So I hope that this can be sort of broadened out, but it's very important. And, this is not only what primaries are for. I guess this is also just, this is much bigger than any presidential election.
I largely agree. And I think that the Clintons have reason to be very nervous right now. As you said about access, and it sounds like they are talking to their campaign, but I've been engaging with people one-on-one in conversation about why they don't turn this to the Republicans, and of course it's a lost cause. They can't get near them, nor, and having watched the debate last week, they have no interest. It was my column right before that was that they devoted less than 1 minute to Black Lives Matter. So it's almost in a way by taking the people who you think are closest aligned to you and trying to convince them how important this is that, it's important. And I think the Black Lives Matter people are going to, those activists are incredibly creative and resilient. I think they're going to find really interesting and entertaining ways to take on the Republicans in the general.
Yes,
but it's not sort of important to deal with them in an electoral season because they're not going to get anyone electorally.
No, I think it's important to deal with Hillary Clinton. I agree with the Republicans. Yeah. I think the Republicans are, they're a white party, let's be honest, right? That is not, the responses on that stage, even frankly by their standards, were pathetic. So no question, they need to be focusing on so-called allies right now. But I do think with Clinton, not just her personally, but the sort of politics that they represent, even just historically in the 80s and 90s, that has a lot to do with this sort of modern legacy when Democratic politicians embraced expanding prisons, drug laws, and all the rest of it. And that needs to be accounted for as well.
Yes.
I really appreciate your time, Stephen. It was great having you on. The piece is Black Lives Matter showed us the oppression of black people is borderless. It's linked to on our website, majority.fm. And thanks so much, Stephen. Be in touch.